What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Thoughts with Nick. We got a gorgeous day today. It's super pleasant out here. It's finally warming up a little bit, and I love it. I love that I don't have to be so bundled up. I love that I'm not freezing. Some of my last videos, not gonna lie, it was pretty cold. But coinciding with that, as the snow starts to melt, it's real sloppy and slushy out here, which is why I'm back recording at the crib today. Hopefully we'll be able to get out in nature a little bit next couple of videos, but even this, it's pretty nice, I gotta say. So anyway, getting things started with the quote. Today's quote is actually a proverb. It's an ancient Chinese proverb, and it goes like this: he that takes medicine but neglects diet wastes the skill of the physician. And I think it's pretty clear what this means, but just to kind of break it down a little bit further, if you're constantly running to the doctor for any ache and pain or any ailment, but you don't work on your diet at all, you eat poorly, you're wasting the doctor's time because you're not controlling the things that you can control. You're kind of outsourcing your own health, which is kind of a personal failure in my opinion, but you know, no judgment, of course, as always, just something to think about. And it's really what we're going to be talking about today is the connection between health and diet, specifically the connection between cancer and diet. And I'm going to be unpacking some of the things that are discussed in this book that I have right here titled Ravenous by a man called Sam Apple. And this book, it's historical, it's biographical, and it ties in a lot of the work of a man called Otto Warburg with some of the contemporary knowledge and understanding that we have today. And a lot, like I said, it's very biographical and historical. A lot of it discusses the life and times of Otto Warburg. So before I get started, or I guess to get started, I think it makes sense to discuss who he was, Warburg that is, and the time period in which he lived. So he was born in Germany in 1883, and he lived there his whole life until he died in 1970. He did, travel a bit, brief stint in America, but he resided in Germany. And this is interesting, of course, because during this time there's two world wars, which largely involved Germany. And the First World War, he was involved in some capacity. I forget exactly what it was that he did, but it's really kind of fascinating that he stayed for the Second World War, because not only was he gay, but he was Jewish as well, which, pretty much makes him a dual candidate for persecution. And yet he came out the other side relatively unscathed compared to pretty much anyone else from those peer groups. He was largely able to continue his work and studies. There was minor impediments and hassles, but compared to what other people from those demographics endured and experienced during that time period, it's pretty crazy. And for better or worse, I guess it's just a testament to the quality of work that he was doing. That he was deemed to be untouchable despite the categories that he found himself in. And just to kind of speak on Germany during the time period that he came up in, and how I think this likely influenced his progression as a scientist. There were just countless really incredible thinkers and generational talents of intellect, and his own father, Emil Warburg, was a Nobel Prize nominee. He didn't actually win. Otto did. We'll get to that later. But that just shows, right from the start, his own father, I'm sure, was a massive inspiration. He had a teacher called Emil Fischer, another high-level scientist. I don't know a lot about that guy, but he was a pretty high-level dude from what I understand. And then a couple of his inspirations and peers, I guess you could call them, were Max Planck, who I used his quote previously, really, applicable quote to what we're talking about here today as well, and Paul Ehrlich. And I discussed Planck a little bit before, you know, the father of quantum mechanics, but Ehrlich is a real cool dude too. I'm pretty sure, invented chemical dyes, which they're calling like the magic bullet for cancer, I think, something like that. I might be a little wrong there, but either way, he did a lot of cool stuff. I'm pretty sure he was involved with developing chemotherapy as well, so really applicable and relevant to the discussion of cancer that we're gonna be having today. And of course, Einstein was in the mix at the time too. So just an incredible setting in terms of all the people around that could be a source of inspiration, just people to bounce ideas off of. You know, like that's a crazy circle. That's a crazy group. So just really a testament to the time, I guess, and the level of work that was being done over there, and how it kind of pushed everyone else to do their best work, because, you know, over here, this guy just dropped this crazy theory, you know, you got to make sure you're on point or you're going to get left in the dust kind of thing. So that just shows, you know, what he was dealing with at the time, and part of what motivated him to be great, I think. And at the same time, not just in Germany, but around the world, cancer rates were skyrocketing, you know, exponential increases. And I mentioned this before, but people use exponential very liberally today. It's kind of like a phrase of expression, a metaphorical expression. But it applies very accurately to the rates of cancer during this time. And like I said, not just in Germany, around the world. And I think this was probably a major factor in why Warburg was so focused on and curious about cancer, I should say, why it was something that he chose to kind of make his life's work, or at least an aspect of his life's work. You know, he was also pretty interested in photosynthesis, but the way that he accessed cancer was through cellular respiration. And what cellular respiration is, if you don't already know, it's how cells breathe. And the reason why I said if you don't already know, we learned it back in school. If you didn't, no worries. I'm not gonna lie, I don't know a ton about it, but I feel like a lot of people probably will know what cellular respiration is just from the name, because, you know, respiration is breathing and cellular implies cells. So cellular respiration, how cells breathe. That was a major exploration of Warburg's, and this is what he won a Nobel Prize for in 1931. So what he won the prize for specifically was he identified the mechanism responsible for cellular respiration, the actual molecule and the part of the molecule, which specifically is the iron-containing group of enzymes called cytochromes. And what these do is they bind to molecular oxygen, which thus acts as a transport, you know, moving the oxygen around within the cell and, you know, conducting the cellular respiration. And interestingly, this is actually the same way that cyanide poisons us. Cyanide boins. I said this the last time I tried to record this video. I said the same exact thing. Cyanide binds to those same cytochromes, and that's why it kills us. It occupies the place that oxygen would, thus inhibiting our cellular respiration. And like I said, this work on cellular respiration, this discovery, won him a Nobel Prize in 1931. It was a pretty big revelation at the time. It was, you know, crazy. And he used this to, what's the right word? He used it as a conduit, I guess you could say, to study cancer. And what I mean by that specifically is he examined how cancer cells breathe. And what he determined is that cancer cells largely do not undergo cellular respiration. They actually undergo fermentation to produce their energy. And what fermentation is that rather than using oxygen to produce the energy, like in cellular respiration, these cancer cells use glucose. That's what the fermentation process is, using glucose to derive your energy. And what he postulated, what he really believed this, was that the reason these cells undergo fermentation rather than cellular respiration is because they're damaged. Their capabilities to do cellular respiration have been inhibited to the degree that they're forced to undergo fermentation instead. And he considered, well, maybe he didn't consider it like this. Maybe they just framed it out like this in the book, so I'm going to use it the same way. How they presented it in the book was fermentation is almost like a backup generator of sorts. Cellular respiration is the main generator, but when that generator fails, when it goes offline, fermentation comes online and allows the cells to, not die. So he thought that cells were forced to switch over to fermentation, and this was due to some type of damage, carcinogenic damage that harmed the cells and destroyed their capacity to perform cellular respiration. And when I was reading the book, I thought this largely tracked. It makes a lot of sense to me. If you just think about something like lung cancer, for example, you're breathing in the smoke, you're inhaling smoke into your lungs, and that damages the cells. And it just kind of makes sense that it would damage their capacity to, work with oxygen, thus forcing them to switch over. And to be clear, this isn't like a one-time exposure type thing. This is long-term, prolonged exposure to these carcinogens that damages the cells. And, this is real. That is a factor in cancer. Absolutely. The inhibition of the cellular respiration capabilities, forcing cells to switch over to fermentation. That's a way that carcinogens work, and it's a way that they cause cancer, for sure. But what Warburg was saying was that it was the universal, ubiquitous cause of cancer was that switch over from cellular respiration to fermentation, which is not true. Cancer cells do a lot of times, maybe not a lot of times, but whatever, it doesn't really matter. Cancer cells can still have the capability to use oxygen. They can still have the capability to perform cellular respiration. The fact of the matter is that cancer cells prefer to use glucose and to undergo fermentation rather than cellular respiration, which is what separates them and differentiates them from healthy cells. So Warburg was right in the aspect that cancer cells primarily use fermentation to supply themselves with energy, but he was wrong in the sense that that's not necessarily the underlying primary factor for why cells become cancerous. It's just what they do. It's not why they do it, but it's what they do. And that process is actually, it's called the Warburg Effect. The switch from cellular respiration to fermentation has been called the Warburg Effect due to his discovery of it, which I think that's cool. I mean, it's a pretty major thing, and to have that named after you, in addition to winning a Nobel Prize for something else, it's just a real testament to his capabilities as a scientist. So, kind of building on that, in 2004, obviously, 30 plus years after Warburg died, so this stuff kind of took a while to be rediscovered and explored further, which, like I said before with Max Planck, really is one of a shame of science that some of these great ideas and great discoveries get forgotten about for so long. But anyway, moving off that, in 2004, it was discovered that AKT, which is a known oncogene, and what an oncogene is a cancer-causing gene. So an oncogene, it's not that the gene itself inherently causes cancer, but mutations on this gene are known to cause cancer. That's my understanding of an oncogene. I might be a little off there, but that's how I know it. So AKT, a known oncogene, was discovered to actually be responsible for the Warburg effect. So they were able to narrow down what causes the switch from cellular respiration to fermentation. And just to be clear, it's not that AKT is solely responsible here, more so that AKT is like the conductor. It's It's the driving force. It's what tells the other mechanisms, genes, I'm not sure exactly what, to end up undergoing the switch. It doesn't act alone. I'll say it like that. And, you know, once again, even this does not inherently lead to cancer. However, if the cells are in the right place at the right time with the mutated AKT, it's highly likely that they'll end up becoming cancerous. And what I mean by the right place at the right time, and the combination of other factors specifically, is that if the cells are in the epithelial lining, which is the lining around our organs, if they haven't been killed, you know, these unhealthy cells, a lot of times they'll be sought out by our immune cell, our immune system, our immune cells, and they'll be targeted and killed. So if they're not killed, and if they're in the epithelial lining, and finally, if they have ready access to glucose, which is, you know, what they use for fermentation, then it becomes likely that they'll become cancerous. So right place, right time, a combination of setting and opportunity, I guess you could say. I mean, I think it's pretty known that cancer is really opportunistic. So this isn't necessarily some shocking thing, but that's, I guess you could say, a large part of the basis of the formation of cancer, or at least a major factor in it. So just to kind of rehash what I've mentioned so far, even though cancer cells can use oxygen, they choose to use glucose instead. So as a result, this begs the question, if rather than targeting the cancer cells through radiation, which the goal there is to kill the cancer cells, rather than kill the cancer cells before other cells, but you know, the radiation treatment does kill all cells in time, which is, it's highly destructive. I don't want to shit on it, but I find it to be a little barbaric, a little word that I've used before is medieval. It's outdated in my opinion, and we could have better ideas, we could have better practices, but we don't, and I find that asinine. So again, not to derail myself, but what we know about cancer and its fundamental decision to choose glucose over oxygen begs the question of, what if we starved it out of glucose? What if we did not provide it with the fuel source that it needs? Would these cells die finally? And unfortunately, the answer is it's not that simple. As I said, cancer is opportunistic. It's also quite resourceful. So in the absence of glucose, it'll move on to glutamine. And even in the absence of glutamine, it's thought that it might move on to fat. You know, maybe they know this now, and I don't, but there's some that they mentioned in the book that it was kind of like, they weren't 100% sure on that, but it seemed likely. So cancer will find a way to continue to propagate itself once it already exists. So this, you know, begets another question. If we can't necessarily starve it out with ease, you know, don't get me wrong, you kind of can. And you kind of can. I'll get to that in a second. But it begs the question of, what about prevention entirely through diet, you know? And this is where diabetes comes in, strangely enough. It doesn't seem like an obvious connection at all, but it actually is a major connection, a major relationship exists there. And this is clear if you take a look at historical data. You know, like I mentioned before, with the exponential increase in the incidence of cancer, the same is true of diabetes. The graphs mirror themselves. And even that, you know, that doesn't necessarily indicate causation, simply correlation, of course. And the relationship, however, is that diabetes leads to a greater level of insulin, a greater level of IGF-1, which is insulin growth factor, and both insulin and IGF-1 tell cells to eat and grow more. Cancer cells often have more IGF-1 receptors than normal healthy cells, and IGF-1 signaling can prevent cell death. So, you know, if we kind of synthesize all of that, the increased insulin not even that. Forget about that for now. IGF-1 tells cells to eat and grow more. IGF-1, cancer cells have more IGF-1 receptors. So these cells are being told to eat and grow more. The IGF-1 also prevents cells from dying. So these cancer cells have more IGF-1, which tells them to eat and grow more and also not die. So I think that, pretty obviously implicates diabetes as a major factor in cancer. And kind of corroborating that and essentially proving it, this is what I wanted to hold off on mentioning a second ago. They proved this through tests with mice, with tumors in mice, that is. So mice with existing tumors, through up or down regulating insulin, they were able to grow and shrink the tumors respectively. That is, by increasing the amount of insulin in mice with existing tumors, they increase the size of the tumor. And by decreasing the amount of insulin in mice with tumors, they were able to shrink the size of the tumor. So it makes it clear that there's an obvious relationship here between insulin and cancer, or at least the growth of tumors at minimum. And taking that a step further, a further confirmation, rats, mice, that's one thing. Okay, but this right here proves it in humans, irrefutably. Well, maybe not irrefutably, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but it proves something. So metformin, which is a diabetes drug, has apparently led to 25 to 40% reduction in the likelihood of cancer in diabetics. So if we tie this all together, how does metformin work? It lowers the glucose level, which thus lowers the insulin. So once again, we finally see the full picture, kind of. We finally see how this cycle works. Glucose is not the only factor here. It's a really crucial factor. Don't get it confused, but it's not the only factor. It's not only the fuel for cancer, but it also raises the level of insulin, which thus increases the IGF-1, which cancer has an increased level of. It's a vicious cycle, and it starts with glucose. Glucose and insulin are the major components in this cycle. It starts with glucose, which leads into insulin and the IGF-1, which are some of the main issues here with cancer. So not only is glucose the primary fuel for cancer, we now see that it's actually one of the main factors in the presence of cancer in the first place. So by reducing our glucose consumption, thus reducing our insulin levels, we can largely protect ourselves. We can protect ourselves from cancer. And I'm all about self-empowerment, right? And there's this massive dogma existing in the world right now that everything's genetics. Everything comes down to genetics. If you're genetically predisposed, you're fucked. You're done. You're cooked. You're chopped. It's over for you. And I think that's fucking bullshit. Don't get it confused. You can't understate the importance of genetics. Genetic factors can't be escaped in certain aspects. But I believe heavily in epigenetics, the combination of environment and genetics. There's genetic factors that exist. Absolutely, that is not debatable. I'm not here to argue or debate that. What I am here to argue, debate, and stand against is that genetics are the end-all be-all. I think that's a lie. I think that is a nihilistic, self-destructive, defeatist perspective that abdicates you from the position of responsibility and power in your own life, and it removes your own capabilities to control and empower yourself. You're removing your own authority, you're removing your own agency simply because you think that you never had the capability to begin with. And a lot of times that's something that's been told to us, and I refuse to accept that. And this is a clear example of it. Of course, these oncogenes can be present. Of course, you can be more likely to develop cancer as a result of things like that. Of course. But through the epigenetic factors, you can largely regulate and decrease the likelihood that this will occur. Epigenetics, the combination of environment and genetics. By limiting your glucose consumption through diet, even if you're predisposed to these things, you can reduce the likelihood. Even if you're predisposed, okay, you might be higher likelihood due to the predisposition, but you can reduce your likelihood within the range of predisposition by regulating your diet. You know, you have control over this. And it's important for me. It's absolutely integral for me to emphasize this to the max, because you need to know this information. You need to know that you have the power. You need to know that you have the control, and you need to do something about it. This is not some far-fetched thing that you don't have control over, that you can't change. You absolutely can do something to, you know, save your own life effectively. And it is of the utmost importance that you take this seriously and do so. So I got real passionate there for a second, and I'm passionate about this. So I feel no need to apologize or qualify my passion. So just to kind of get back to the point here, fructose does the same thing. Glucose plus fructose equals sugar, and an increased sugar or a high consumption of sugar leads to insulin resistance due to the increased presence of insulin. And how the insulin resistancy works is there's an increased level of insulin required in the blood to effectively process the glucose. So due to the increased level thus becomes normalized, thus leading to the resistance. If that doesn't make sense, I feel like I didn't explain it great right there. If that doesn't make sense, I would look it up, look up how type 2 diabetes works. And just to be clear, like, a lot of what I'm talking about here when I say diabetes does refer to type 2, because that's the one that's developed, you know, throughout your own life, compared to type 1, which you're born with. And, you know, not only does sugar spike your insulin, rapidly digested carbs spike insulin as well. And this is something I've touched on before with my own struggles with carbs and how I love them, and how I've had to work on this. And this book right here is a large reason why I took it serious to work on my consumption of carbs, because I know it's a vice that I have, and I learned that it's very problematic because of this insulin spike and because of what goes along with that. And, you know, it's just an example. Oh man, a big ass hawk just flew over the top. That was cool as hell. Gotta love it. Wow, that really just put a smile on my face. So anyway, focusing back in here, carbs have the same effect, you know, rapidly digested carbs, that is. And I've touched on this before, how they're so ubiquitous in our diet. A bagel for breakfast, a sandwich for lunch, pasta for dinner. It's a perpetuating cycle. And, you know, when you have carbs with all three meals, of course you're setting yourself up for insulin resistancy. You know, you're setting yourself up for diabetes. And to kind of like divulge into a personal story, you know, there's a guy that I know. Unfortunately, I'm not as close with him anymore, just, you know, through the paths of life, right? We went to high school together, and he's a close friend of mine, still a good friend, just don't see him as much anymore, don't talk to him as much, because we're both real busy, you know. That's just the way things go. Side note, I'd fucking love to reconnect with this dude. He's a cool-ass guy. But anyway, he's like one of the healthiest people I knew. I you know, like, biological specimen, right? And one time he told me, this is in high school, that the doctors told him he had pre-diabetes, and I was just like, what, bro? Like, you're like the peak of health, I thought, you know. So just like to kind of use that as an example, it blew my mind that you can be in like tip-top shape. Like, this dude, like I said, you know, physical specimen, running, the cardiovascular, the musculature, all that, and yet he still had this pre-diabetes. And we laughed about it. Like, we laughed because we were like, dude, what the fuck are they talking about, bro? Like, you're good. And now, like, reading this book, it kind of came full circle to me that, like, it was potentially due to his diet, you know. I don't know that for sure. I don't want to put that on him and say that for sure, because I don't know that, but it just kind of made sense, that all these physical factors can be in line, but if your diet's wrong, if your diet's incorrect, you can still set yourself up for these things despite everything else being good. So you can kind of be living in almost like a sort of cognitive dissonance where all these things are good, similar to what I talked about before with something else. I forget what it was, whatever, where like you can be doing all these things good, so you think you're fine to eat whatever you want, but that's what it was, the caloric expenditure. Anyway, you think that you're good to eat whatever you want, but in reality, you're just simply not, because these things still take place within your bloodstream. You're still going to have that insulin spike. You're still going to develop that insulin resistance. You're still going to move down that progression towards type 2 diabetes, thus, making you much more likely, due to the abundance of glucose, for a potential cancerous situation. And, I got another quote here. This was mentioned in the book from a guy called Richard Johnson. I got no idea who that is. What he said was, if you want to make cancer happy, feed it fructose. So just to kind of wrap this video up, I actually think I did a pretty decent job of framing out a lot of what's covered in this book, and kind of the connection between cancer and diet, specifically how it hinges upon glucose, and not just glucose. I want to be clear, because they touched on this in the book. Before I get into kind of my recommendations and stuff, it's not just glucose. Sugar as well, which is the combination of glucose and fructose. It's not just glucose. Glucose and fructose, which is sugar, in addition to carbs. There's multi things here at play. I don't want to just single out glucose and demonize glucose, because glucose is used for energy. It's kind of somewhat important, and I don't know the ins and outs of the necessities of it, but you can't really get around it, right? So I don't want to totally demonize it unduly, but it's important to emphasize that it is the fuel source that cancer uses. So if we can minimize it, that would be great. And there are ways to minimize it, which is what I'm going to get into now. So step one, most important step, probably the easiest step, would be to eliminate sugary drinks, things like soda, things like fruit juice. Right away, this is going to really, cut back the amount of said sugar in your bloodstream. It's immediately going to kind of hopefully start to reset the insulin levels and just get you on a path back to normalcy. Soda, you got to cut that shit out. There's really no way to cut corners on this one. Soda really has no place in a healthy, cancer-free diet. And next, my next recommendation would be to minimize sugar consumption on the whole. Sugar's fine if it's coming from fruit, natural sugars, right? But even smoothies, I'm highly skeptical of, because you're combining a lot of different fruits and into one thing and chugging it down real quickly, quicker than it would normally be processed by the body, or in the way of eating it. And going along with that, when you eat fruit, the enzymes in your saliva, in your oral biome, they break down the sugars in a more efficient manner versus just pouring it down your gullet and overwhelming your stomach with a mass dump of sugar. So I'm highly skeptical of things like that, and you should be too. I mean, don't just take my word for it. As with all things, as with this book, these are my conclusions. Read it for yourself and determine if I'm right or wrong. Look up the smoothies for yourself. Determine if I'm right or wrong. This is just my thoughts. Thoughts with Nick, baby. So, yeah, like I said, the next step would be to minimize sugar consumption. Try and remove all added sugars from your diet if you can. It's really, really hard. There's still some places in my diet where I have that. Like the yogurt that I have has added sugar. I believe the granola that I have does too. So it's tough to escape, but you got to really try and minimize it as much as you can, because if you're not paying close attention, it's so ubiquitous, it's everywhere, it's going to seep into your every single meal without you ever even knowing. And just like I mentioned with the carbs, it's going to end up, leading to a perpetually raised level of insulin in your bloodstream, which is kind of like the hallmark of these issues that I'm discussing today, which lead to cancer. So next, the third step, this one's a little harder. It was kind of hard for me, but you should try and minimize carbs as well. And I know it sucks to hear if you're anything like me, but you got to give it a try. You know, I'm not here to tell you, you know, what to do or not to do, just suggestions and recommendations. But I would definitely recommend it. You know, try and, you don't have to cut it out entirely, right? I still love my pretzels. I love them. I still have like a sourdough pretzel a day. I can't really cut them out entirely, but I'm not binging on them anymore. I still have a bagel once or twice a week, but I'm not having it every day. That's a no. I rarely eat things like pasta, but I love it when I have it. And I feel like it makes the enjoyment and the engagement with those foods that much greater when it's not an everyday occurrence, because you can look forward to it. You can derive more pleasure from it, you know. I don't know. I don't want to kind of derail myself again, because I already have a few times during this video, but that's kind of like really the next step that I would say. Like, step one, eliminate sodas and sugary drinks. Step two, eliminate sugar as much as possible. That's going to be things like ice cream, things like, you know, all kinds of snacks, really. And step three, if you can do steps 1 and 2, keep it 100 with you. You're way ahead of most people. Take it to step 3, reducing carbs. You're going to be in really, really good shape, in my opinion. Step 4, this is where you really start to take it over the top. This is where I'm at, and I'm proud of myself for this. And if you can take it here with me, you should be proud of yourself too. And this is fasting. I fast once a week. Typically, I'll go 24 hours. For a while, I was doing 36. I backed it down to 24 just because the 36, it's a little hard. You know, going to sleep on an empty stomach is hard. And I should actually probably start doing that again. Maybe not keep doing the 24 every week, but maybe the 36 once a month. I've done, you know, a couple 40+ hour fasts. I haven't got up to 48. I think I maxed out at 45 hour fast, which I'm gonna be real with you. I was getting like real fatigued. I was feeling weak, all that type of stuff, which maybe I didn't prepare properly. There's certain things that you're supposed to do, and maybe I didn't do it for those, but regardless, you know, I fast once a week, and there's a lot of benefits with fasting that I'm going to touch on in a second. But I think if you can, you should really try and give that a shot. Of course, prepare yourself for it first. If you're not already doing intermittent fasting, start with that. Start with a 16-hour fast. You know, eat within an 18-hour. Eat within an 8-hour window. Like, maybe you start eating at 10 a.m., you stop by 6. You start at 11 a.m., stop by 7. Typically, my window is even a little smaller than that. I'll try and go 1 p.m. to 7 p.m. if I can, and I'll fast for roughly 18 hours a day in a perfect day. Doesn't always go that way, but I absolutely try to keep it within an 8-hour window every day. 12 to 8 is my maximum eating window. And even that, you know, you can do better. I can do better. But I would highly recommend fasting. Look into it, figure out what's right for you. Start with intermittent fasting, ideally with a 16-hour window, and try and build up to the 24-hour. If you can, you know, take it a step further. Take it to the 36. Take it to the 48. Take it even to the 72. That's really where I think there's a lot of benefits. I haven't been able to get there yet, but this year I would absolutely love to. So just to touch on why I think fasting is so important, why I've incorporated it into my life, and why I think you should too, and how it relates to this book, this material, the Cancer Diet Connection. So when you fast, you're starving your body, obviously. This gives your metabolism a chance to reset. This gives the insulin levels a ability to normalize, and thus, you know, eliminate or at least reduce the insulin resistancy, so that when you experience those spikes, your body will be better enabled to process them efficiently and effectively, because they're not the norm, because you're giving your body some downtime to kind of get back to the baseline, back to normal. You're not kind of constantly living in that heightened state. So that's really the main the main reason why I fast, is to initiate those metabolic benefits. But there's other stuff too. They say there's cardiovascular benefits. They say there's mental benefits too. I mean, of course, you know, the one of just like doing something hard and proving to yourself that you can do it. But they actually say like mental cognition, there's benefits with that too. There's a lot of stuff. You should look into it. You should look it up. But the main reasons that I do it are for the metabolic health, to bring down my resting blood glucose, or fasted blood glucose, that is. Yes. Bring down my fasted blood glucose, reduce my insulin sensitivity, and just kind of give my body a chance to get back to normal. And I think it's a really, really important thing to do. I've been doing it probably for about a year now, and I would recommend you give it a try too, because I've noticed great benefits. So just to wrap it up, the final piece, which I'm not doing, I don't see myself doing, and it's really fucking hard to do, would be ketogenesis, because then or ketosis rather, which puts your body in a state of ketogenesis. And in able to do that, you would have to be entirely carb free, probably entirely sugar free too. I'm not 100% sure on that part, but carb free for sure. And what ketogenesis is it's a state of no glucose. So rather than burning glucose for energy, you're using ketones, which is actually a more efficient form of energy. It's better, but it's just so hard to get to that level of dietary control and really dietary perfection. You know, that's a standard of perfection. And I don't think that's realistic for a lot of people. Right now, it's not realistic for me. It's probably really great for your health, and maybe it's the peak of human health. I don't know a lot about ketogenesis, ketosis. I don't. I just know that it burns ketones instead of glucose, and that would probably go a really long way to preventing or absolutely starving cancer. I know they recommend a ketogenic diet for people with cancer, so that kind of proves my point. So those are kind of the steps that I would take, you know, the steps that I would recommend. And just to restate them again before I wrap up, and I'll end with this: eliminate sugary drinks. This should be the first and utmost priority. Next, step 2, eliminate sugar consumption as much as you possibly can outside of, you know, fruit and things like that. Third, reduce and minimize carbs as much as possible. You know, I'm not going to tell you to eliminate them, especially coming from someone like me. That's straight up hypocritical. And step 4, incorporate fasting into your daily routine or weekly routine somehow, whether it's intermittent fasting on a daily basis. I think that's a good thing to do. Or a weekly fast like I do. I think that's really good too. And then finally, the step that I'm not doing, and the step that I don't see myself doing, but the step that would probably be achieving perfection in these matters, would be ketogenesis. So I'm going to wrap there, guys. Thank you for taking the time to listen in. This is really, really important content, really, really important material. If you can, go get your hands on this book, Ravenous by Sam Apple. You know, I didn't even begin to get into a lot of the different historical events that are laid out in there. I didn't really get into a lot of the biographical details that are laid out in there either. It's a really cool book. It combines biography through, or it combines history through biography and the historic context of the time and setting with some really incredible scientific discoveries, and then ties them all together with the contemporary knowledge that we have today to paint this really excellent picture on the connection between diet and cancer that has really changed my life, how I look at food, and, you know, how I eat on a day-to-day basis. And just to once again leave you with this: you have more control than you think. You have more control than you think over your life, over your outcomes, over everything, you know, everything. So do what you can, do your part. Yeah, and hopefully this message resonates with you. Hopefully you can take something from this, learn and grow, incorporate it into your life. and lead a more healthy lifestyle in a way that will prevent you from getting cancer, because that's what I want, man. I don't want anyone out there to get cancer. If you can avoid it, that's what you should strive for, because this is not a necessary reality. We can avoid these outcomes, and you have the power to do so. So thank you guys. Thank you for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of your day.